Hey, what's up? And welcome to episode 1 of the Emotional Bankroll podcast. In this series, I talk to DFS pros about the highs and lows and lifestyle of playing fantasy sports for a living. Sure, you may have the financial means to go pro, but do you have the emotional bankroll to deal with the ups and downs? In episode 1, I talk with Colin Drew. You may know him as Drewby417 on Twitter, DFSteams on DraftKings, formerly of Daily Roto. Colin has nearly $1 million in lifetime DFS profits. He has countless NFL Showdown wins, and he's the DraftKings 2020 Fantasy Hockey World Champion. Yet, despite all of this success, Colin recently left the DFS industry to pursue a job at a tech startup. It's a very interesting conversation. Colin reveals a lot, and I think you'll really enjoy it. Now, this is an audio-only podcast, so make sure you subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, or here on YouTube. Make sure you're subscribed to get notified when we upload any new episodes. I have a lot of interesting and high-profile guests lined up for the future. Let us know what you think. We'd love to know what you think about Colin's interview, who you would like to see in future episodes. So just leave us a comment here on YouTube and give us a thumbs up if you like the new series. Without further ado, let's bring in Colin. All right, let's bring in Colin. Colin, what's up, man? It's been a few weeks since you and I have talked to each other, but I'm glad to catch you during your lunch break during the corporate life.
Yeah, you guys can't see me because we're doing audio, but I've got the suit and tie on. I'm just at my desk here, very formal. No, everything's pretty much the same for me, man. Different job, obviously a little bit less focused on DFS these days, especially the first few weeks, but it's always good chatting with you.
Yeah, it is, of course. And I just wanted to sit down with you and kind of recap your DFS career. And I appreciate you taking the time out of your day. So let's get right into it. And I think there's no better way than to start with the highs, right? You're primarily known for your massive NFL Showdown wins, right? 2018, you have the 50K win, the 175K win in like a 2-week span. Fast forward to 2019, you have 3 separate 6-figure wins in less than 10 weeks. So I have to ask, after those stretches, what was your mindset like after those big wins?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like almost helpful to understand the mindset going into it because like I transitioned into the DFS industry without like aspirations of becoming a DFS pro. I was like transitioning out of my last job at the time that Drew Dinkmeyer and Mike Leone were, selling Daily Roto to Sports Grid, and they were looking for somebody to handle like the business side of things. And so I kind of came in with this as like a career move from a lifestyle perspective, with the ability to take the FS seriously on the side was definitely like a benefit, but I never really envisioned myself becoming a DFS pro. And like the ironic part of it was like when Showdown first came out, I was super against the format. I thought it was just like super high variance, like super low edge, a ton of randomness, like base DK or FanDuel would send all these offers, and I was like, no thanks, like I'm not really going to do this Showdown thing. So that was pretty interesting to see how it like transitioned that way.
Little did you know that you would turn all that randomness into those wins. So, okay, so those wins happen, right? And at some point you had to have, and maybe you didn't have to, but maybe you step back and did you just take a look and realize like, okay, 75K, 175K, 100K, 100K, 100K. Did you ever just like look at it from a high level and maybe think that, wow, I'm actually one of the best in the world at what I do?
Yeah, I wouldn't say like one of the best in the world, but I did think I was, well, I guess like a top player who had a really good strategy that was also running at like an insanely high level of variance. So I've always been like rooted in this belief that I have an edge, but also for this, especially this time period you're talking about, that I was like running at like the 99th percentile as far as like positive variance. Like I was winning like once a month for like 2 years, and even if you were the best player in the world, that is not something that is really achievable. And so I was kind of always like rooted in that, but at the same time realizing that it was like an edge that I should push on, and that a lot of people weren't producing content on it. So that was like an edge from a company perspective where we could potentially get into the market early and capture people who are starting to take this seriously. It was an edge from like a player perspective because you were doing things in a way that the field wasn't doing at that point in time, and nobody was really talking about the strategy. So definitely felt like I was playing from a position of edge while at the same time like being insanely hot on the variance spectrum.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But you have to pat yourself on the back at some point because you had those Showdown wins, but you're also the 2020 DraftKings Fantasy Hockey World Champion, which, yeah, of course, the 100K top prize is very nice. Let's not take that for granted, right? But I listened to an interview you did with Pat Mayo a couple of years ago, and you said you started in hockey because there wasn't a lot of great content out there. You started building your own projections, your own modeling. So to go from that to being crowned the champion in a space where it's super competitive, it's full of sharp individuals, that has to feel amazing, right?
Yeah, I think like the moments like I remember the most from DFS is probably my first like 20K score was in golf of all things, but just like the sweat of golf. It was, back when people would play Luke Donald at 50% owned at like RBC Heritage, and so I just remember like sweating. It was like Andy Sullivan, like David Lingworth, Justin Rose, like all these dudes at the Memorial, and so I just remember that was like my first figure score. I remember that two, big showdown scores, especially the 175K one, were like just like gut wrenching sweats. Where like there was a kneel down that if he had, instead of kneeling down, had done a QB sneak forward, like would have been like a 6 figure swing. So like
Mm.
that was a super moment. But the Fantasy Hockey World Championship, definitely the most enjoyable of them, and especially because I came up like grinding hockey. It felt like it was one of the things that was like a bucket list accomplishment, almost in the same way that people dream about like making the millionaire maker. It's like winning a live final in hockey of all things was definitely something that was awesome. And a lot of my early DFS friends I made like through DFS hockey chats and Twitter threads and stuff like that. So it was all pretty cool.
Yeah, yeah, especially the camaraderie aspect of it. You meet the people at the live final, and then you beat those people, and you become the champion. It's just absolutely an incredible feeling. Let's talk about the lifestyle a little bit because I know a lot of people listening are curious about the lifestyle of a DFS pro, someone who creates content full time. And specifically because I think about this often, the balance between work life and DFS. Am I spending enough time with my family, my friends, my significant other? You personally, Colin, you have two young daughters, right? You played NHL DFS, you still play NHL DFS. How do you personally balance that between creating lineups and being there for bath time, dinner, being there for your wife and your family?
Yeah, it's definitely something that's evolved, and it had gotten harder as like the girls got older. So when I first started, I guess it was like 4 years ago, and in August, and so a little more than 4 years ago. And my first daughter I had in November of that year. So I was married, but no kids when I started doing this, and so I was when I was in the industry, I went through a ton of life transitions, right? Like first girl, have a second girl, move into my first house, go through the entire pandemic. So there's been like a lot of crazy things that we've been going through as a society the last couple of years, and then for me, like with the family growth the past 4 years. And I think the balance was definitely something that was easier when your kid is young, and it's like a one-on-one thing with the wife. You can just work out like the schedule. It definitely gets harder as the kids get older and as they start to realize that like you're not there at bedtime. So things are different with like a 4 year old, I think, than they were with a newborn. And yeah, I think there's different types of DFS pros, I guess. If I don't call myself that, but you could argue I was playing at a professional level for a few years, but I still had like the full-time job. Like I still had a role within Sports Grid that was bigger than just producing content for Daily Roto. And so, in a way, the flexible hours and the flexible lifestyle of that job enabled me to kind of have the time off almost as much as like the family stuff did.
Right, and you think about it, right? I assume you enjoy what you did, right? And you think about
Of
people
course.
who work all the time, lawyers, doctors, whatever, and they're not there for their families, and they wish they probably could be. But you think about it, and just because you enjoy it doesn't mean you're not there any less. So I think that's always something. Like you're in it, you're building lineups, you're creating content. You're like, I really like this, but you still have to think in the back of your mind, like, wow, I still have my family that I need to take care of and spend quality time with them, right?
Yeah, for sure. And like I've had different types of jobs. Like my first 4 years out of school, I was doing like government contract consulting, and that was not very inspiring and not something I like woke up and looked forward to going to. Then I spent 4 or 5 years working for Living Social, which was like a daily deals startup, one of the fastest growing startups in DC. That was a lot more exciting than government contracting, especially during the growth phases. And it was a pretty young company and a pretty young culture. So like a lot of going out after work or drinking beers at the desk from 5 till 7, and then going to happy hour and stuff, and then transitioned into this. So I've been pretty lucky, especially over the past few years, to have like a pretty good lifestyle. But working in the industry was definitely like, yeah, I mean, it's a great lifestyle. The DFS side of things is interesting just because like feel like there are different phases of like my relationship with DFS. When it was a hobby, when I was playing casually, when it was a hobby but I was playing for a little bit more money, when I started to take it like super serious, and like my relationship with DFS sort of evolved over the period of time too.
Right. So what about holidays? You and I talked recently about working on Christmas. So did you enjoy working on holidays? How was that that feeling to you? Did it feel like work when Thanksgiving, Christmas, you're going to your family's house, laptop in hand? After dinner, I gotta fix lineups, or I gotta pump out this content. Like, how was that for you? And then how did your family respond to that grind?
Yeah, for me, like the work side of things, like handling customer support cases, like people don't have access to the site, they need to reset their password, like that type of stuff on holidays sucks pretty bad
Yes.
because it's not very fun. The playing DFS side for me was not as big of a strain. Like I enjoy it. I enjoy the holiday slates. Often like the 3 game slates, they're fun. Like they have their own wrinkles. So I actually like enjoyed the playing side of things, and yeah, taking like a few hours in the morning, typically to kind of get set on things wasn't too big of a deal. And yeah, I'd say the customer service stuff is pretty brutal on the holidays, but in general, I think family's been pretty supportive of it. And yeah, a few hours away from the chaos of family holidays is never a terrible thing either.
Very true. Get away from that for a little bit, and yeah, the customer support, no matter which day of the year it is always pretty brutal. So, all right. So speaking about the playing side of things, right? Inevitably, we're gonna have highs and lows as DFS players, and you're married. Now, if you're a single guy, right, that's one thing. You handle the highs and lows by yourself, whatever it may be. You have a partner, right? And you have to have those conversations with her. So what are those conversations like with your wife, and the financial side of things, the highs and lows? Does she understand them? Do you honestly report them? How's those conversations go?
Yeah, I mean, she definitely understands what's going on, and like obviously when we comes time at the end of the year to file taxes or whatever, like the numbers are right there. And so I think like try not to bring her too much into like the sweat or like the swings, and just handle that stuff like internally. And if she asks how I'm doing on the year, kind of give like a general update, but not try to get her like stressed over
Yes.
whatever the last 4 weeks or the last 4 months. And so yeah, I mean, I think that is definitely something that's tough. I think for the most part, like I've been lucky enough to run it up pretty high, and so like I've always been playing from well in a position of profit. And so like even like this past year will be a losing year for me. It's kind of like it's humbling, and it's also something that is like you don't like to be like, hey honey, like we lost 60K this year, but
Yeah.
but at the same time, like when you're coming from like a position of substantial profit, it's a little bit easier to have that conversation because I wasn't, in my opinion, gambling. Like I was putting money in when I thought I was getting in it good. Maybe I was and just ran bad, or maybe I wasn't getting in it good and didn't realize it until too late. But I think as long as the goal is to make money, like I think the losses are acceptable. If the goal is to you're just gambling for fun, like that's also acceptable too, but like probably have different thresholds for that type of thing.
Yeah, it's all about the perspective, right? And it's all about having that understanding with your partner or significant other of what the expectations are. So, are you able to? So you mentioned the 60K loss this year, right? And it is humbling when something like that happens. Are you able to compartmentalize the highs and lows of DFS compared to your regular life? Like you have a 175K sweat, you have milli sweats, you have on the low side a 60K loss, right? Does that change how you respond to the highs and lows of everyday life?
I haven't really had that. I've been lucky. It hasn't really like impacted me. Like whatever, if we're going out with friends or the girls or doing family stuff, or I'm hanging out with my buddies from college. Like the wins and losses don't necessarily get to me at that level. I'd say like the sweats, like when you're in like the sweat in that moment or whatever. Maybe you're staying up till 12:30 in the morning when you shouldn't be or whatever. Like that's definitely been an impact. I would say in a way, and it's kind of like one of the things that helped make it easier to transition away was just like started being totally desensitized to the money side of things. And so like winning when I first won like 20K, like that felt better than winning 100K felt in like 2019 or whatever.
It's messed
Just
up, right?
because it's really messed up. And like losing like money this year like didn't really get to me mentally. And it's probably like as long as you're like thoughtful about whether or not you have an edge, that's probably okay. But like there was a part of me that was like, well, maybe I should be like feeling this loss more than I am or whatever.
Yeah, because you could. I don't know if you're like me. Do you think about, okay, if I didn't max that showdown slate and airball it, I could have paid my mortgage this month, or like I've lost 60K in the past 3 months. That's more than some people make an entire year, right? Do you ever rationalize it that way?
I think less about like the trade-off versus like what I could be spending it on, but for sure like just the total dollar amount is definitely sobering. And yeah, I mean like I would not go to a casino and lose $5,000. This is something I would never do.
True.
And but I would easily play fast and lose $5,000 for the course of a week. So like that's something that's weird and interesting to think about.
Yeah, so just hearing you say that, and then from our previous conversations, you've always been, to me at least, reasoned, rational, a balanced person, and I think many would think that's the ideal personality type to handle a long-term DFS grind. But the question is, just because I feel that way about you doesn't necessarily mean you feel that way about yourself. So like internally, while you're playing DFS over the last couple of years, did you actually feel reasoned, rational, balanced as you're going through these highs and lows?
Yeah, I mean, I felt like I was pretty reasonable and rational. There's definitely like moments of doubt that like creep in. Like one thing that happened, I guess 2020, but was Drew and Mike transitioned away from Daily Roto and Sports Grid to establish the run, and they were obviously integral in creating the product, like me into the industry, but also just from like a projections perspective, creating high quality projections, and that was stuff that I was using as part of my play. And so when they transitioned away, like I took more of a role in the projection process. We brought on like Davis, Andrew Barron, other folks, Chris Pacheco, a bunch of people who help with the projections, but you're playing with like inputs from a different group of people. And so there was like this moment of time where I was trying to tease out like how much of the success is like stuff I was doing versus like the quality of the information that I was using, and is that quality of information changing over time. And so that year I ended up having like a 6-figure year by the end, but there were periods of time where I was like negative for a while. And so you're going through these like internal struggles of doubt a little bit as far as what was, your value add to the process versus like what you were taking away. And obviously information that you're inputting into your process is critical too, so it's ultimately linked. But trying to like understand that as it relates to whether or not I still had an edge was something that was a tough thing to wrestle with last year.
Yeah, it's tough in general, and I always talk about the cycle of having a big hit and thinking you're one of the best players, or at least thinking you have a fantastic edge,
Sure.
to starting to lose and thinking, the variance is not going my way, until you get to the point that you just talked about, where the self-doubt creeps in. You're like, am I even good anymore? Am I good at DFS? Is the edge gone? Am I going to lose all my money? Like this cycle continues. So let's talk about the lows for a little bit. So when you get down in the lows and that self-doubt starts to creep in, do you have a process when your bankroll is in a valley, or any tips or tricks in dealing with the significant losses? And I guess to follow up on that, was there any point ever that was a cause of you to look to transitioning out of DFS, or thinking I need to get a different job?
Yeah, so I think one thing, I guess like a tip or whatever, I've been like good at compartmentalizing like DFS from impacting the rest of my life. Not everyone's necessarily able to do that, but I think if you're able to kind of set it aside as like one thing, it's something you're doing presumably to make money. You can kind of set it aside with other investment activities or whatever other income stream. You can kind of set it aside. So I was good at that. I think one thing I was not as good at, there are definitely, I don't tilt from like an emotional perspective really, but there were definitely times when looking back, I tilted from like a process perspective. Like I think a key piece of like a lot of processes that I have is comparing like the odds of a player being in an optimal lineup compared to his ownership projections, and trying to identify some edge there, either as it relates to players on whole or stacks or like captains. And so there are definitely moments where like that process should have led to me playing Derrick Henry as captain against Buffalo, and instead led to me playing, Steph Diggs and Josh Allen, because they were or whatever heavy favorites and have a good run. Like some of these soft things that you should not necessarily take into account. So to me, that's something where I like look and I'm like, oh, I unchecked Derrick Henry as captain, and like I remember after that slate being like, oh, I would have made 200K if I hadn't done that, because he was in the 20th optimal lineup with like whatever the backup tight end that caught the touchdown was. And I was like, that was definitely tilt. Like that, it wasn't an emotional tilt, but like it was definitely a process induced tilt by going through this like long, I guess year and a half downswing within Showdown specifically. Even though I had a good year last year, I was down in Showdown. I just made it up in like other slates and main stuff. So that's something where I definitely see is like an area of tilt impacting you where you may not really realize you're doing it.
Yeah, and that's the big thing, right? Like consciously, you can probably find some spots, but subconsciously, there's so many spots too that your process is being impacted by the downswing, whether it's the emotional or financial, whatever it may be, and you have to be aware of those at all times. So,
I was
sorry.
thinking like the math of like, I mean, like Rex Burkhead or like players like that when you're like, oh, they look like an interesting leverage play, but like it's Rex Burkhead. Like, do I really buy into this? Like, and so there's definitely like times there that I think when you're going through downswings, like maybe you're less aggressive. Whereas when you're like riding hot, you're like, oh, I'm definitely going to play Traquan Smith at captain. Like, even though he's never had more than 100 receiving yards in a game, like who cares? Like, it's the right way to play. And so I think when you're going through these like good times, it's easy to be aggressive with like the right decisions. When you're going through these downswings, sometimes you probably play too cautious, or maybe I found myself playing too cautious, and that probably can contribute to like extending a downswing.
Okay, so because that was my next question is, when you're on these down swings, do you continue to press those edges? Do you pull back your allocation? Do you play more conservatively? Because it is tough to do that, right? You keep getting hammered with losses and losses and losses, and you get to that, again, that self-doubt creeps in. You're like, all right, am I even doing this correctly? When the way to that you became profitable in the first place were pressing those edges. So it's tough to deal with. And when that is potentially happening in your process from a bankroll allocation standpoint, are you still playing somewhat aggressively? Are you pulling back considerably during those losses? Or do you still think that, hey, I know I have an edge here, or I think I have an edge here. I need to still play the same contest or allocation that I've been playing?
Yeah, it's definitely a tough one. I'd say that is like there's like the tilt where maybe you handle your process incorrectly, side of things. I don't think I did that very well. I also don't think I did bankroll management very well, but and that goes twofold. Like I scaled up my play a little bit when I was going through the heater, but I mostly stuck to the same contest. I didn't move up in stakes too much, and I took chances here and there. I took some shots, but like for the most part, continued to play a similar volume. And I've never really had like a bankroll because like the amount of money I made from DFS was way more than I was willing to lose. So like my whatever lifetime DFS profits like approached a million or whatever, and I was never gonna lose that much money. It just was like not. So my bankroll is definitively less than that, but I wasn't like, oh, the max I'm willing to lose is 50K or 60K or 100K. And so I've been had this like I guess like soft approach to it where like you're scaling things down a little bit as you're going through a losing streak, while at the same time like sticking to the general principles that the run up. But I do think it's important to have like a number in mind and like a more disciplined approach to how you're scaling things up or down. And that's one of the areas. I don't know how you handle it. Like you've had tremendous amount of success as well. Like you look at the total like profit you've made in DFS as your bankroll or like after taxes or whatever, or you like you define some subset of that you would be willing to play with before you moved on or whatever.
Yeah, I think you have to define some sort of subset unless you're
Yeah.
just, I mean, if you're like, but again, it depends on how much too, right? If we're talking life-changing money, like $1 million can literally change the course of your life just based on if you invest it properly or however it may be. And yeah, you have to have some sort of subset because if you're willing to risk it all, then, I think that's a dangerous game. You need some sort of your lifestyle has to match that. And I obviously wasn't willing to do that, so I think you have to have a subset of it, and it's a difficult decision because you're now dealing with numbers that you've never dealt with before. At least in my sense, and I'm sure in your sense, once you got to a certain threshold, you're dealing with numbers that you never thought you would be dealing with, and so it's a different concept. Do you wish though that? Because you said you were on the conservative side. Do you wish that you would allocate it more, or instead of you say the most I'll lose is 50K, the most I'll lose is 400K, and you pressed it more and you played bigger contests? Do you ever wish that you did that?
I mean, in hindsight, like whatever 2018 did extend into 2019 despite me not thinking it could, and so like it's easy to look back in hindsight and be like, oh, maybe I could have made 3 times as much if I'd also maxed the $33 with the same lineups in addition to the $10. Because you're winning the $10, you're probably winning everything else, and so yeah, there's like a little bit, but at the same time, if I'd done that, this year, like could get wrecked. So I think it was probably the right decision, and I think I regret not having like a hard bankroll number in mind, but I had like a soft range, and like I feel like I played within that range, so it probably worked out fine. But if you're listening to this or you're aspiring to be like a DFS pro, like it's probably a area where you could use some work, and probably an area where we've seen some of the best players leave the industry for good because they didn't have a disciplined approach to that.
Literally, like we've seen some of the top pros literally go bust, right? They've literally lost everything. So yeah, and again, there's no right answer here, right? With bankroll management, it's a very tough area to define, and the risk reward is different for everyone. So all right, so I want to talk about this transition now, right? So you're in the corporate life now. You recently made this decision to take the full-time job outside of the DFS and betting world. When making this decision to exit DFS, did you feel like you could prove, knowing that it might be impossible, right? But did you feel like that you could prove that the edges in Showdown or whatever it may be that you were playing were diminishing or gone completely? Or was it more of this is a less exciting puzzle to solve than it used to be, and you needed something more engaging for your brain?
Yeah, so of my like profits, it's probably been like 75-80% from Showdown. So like was profitable in most of the classic formats that I played. Golf, I don't think was going to be profitable for me moving forward to the same extent it had been when it was in its like early nuance. Doesn't mean there aren't edges there, but at least for my approach, I didn't think it was going to work. Hockey, I didn't think it was really going to work. And again, I think there were still edges, but like the year that I won the Fantasy Hockey World Championship, I mean, it was awesome to have happen, but I also like that was me being able to capitalize a little bit on like the bankroll I'd achieved and the growth I'd achieved from like the Showdown stuff, as much as it was some like edge I was pushing. I probably had a bigger edge in hockey the years I didn't win or didn't qualify for the Fantasy Hockey World Championship than the year that I actually won it. And then the Showdown stuff, so that was like where a lot of the income was coming from. And that's stuff that is evolved a lot. And I think that when I was first doing it, there were lower variance ways to make money that were still tremendously profitable. And I think some of the ways that you could make money now are extremely high variance. And a lot of the way that I had initially been playing it, like I was never playing quarterbacks at captain, like I was playing wide receivers. I was, forcing stacking rules before the entire field was doing that. And I was probably getting a little bit deeper into the player pool with like some of these punts and like bad plays than like the field was comfortable doing. And so that stuff, I was lucky enough to have like a process that worked, run good at the variance, but also it was a lower variance approach. I do think that there's still edge in Showdown. I think a lot of that is coming from identifying the ways to minimize your dupes and, when to break correlation rules as it relates to dupes, and still tracking like the meta as far as how the field's playing with like captain ownerships. But in order to reduce dupes, you're ultimately like playing a lot more high variance.
You're playing less likely. You're playing less likely outcomes, right? For the chance of a larger payday that's going to hit less often than it would if you played a lower variance approach, right?
And a lot of the content, like some of the worst thing is that like a DFS player that can happen is like somebody does a great content, hits a huge platform, and like Cody Main like does tremendous shit on content and has influenced the way the field plays a lot, and he found like this huge platform, and so like inevitably a lot of the people get better. Like the MME users when we were first starting, like I don't remember how many there were, but maybe like 30 guys maxing slates. Now there's like 150 or something. And so that's changed a lot too. So that I do track like 1% rates, like top 1% rates. And mine have trended down and Showdown specifically over time. And so that was another area where I was able to look at things. And like I do think there is an edge. I think some of the ways I was playing were more risky, we're reducing dupes more frequently. I do think there is still an edge, but it was definitely something where I was seeing my results trend down over time, like losses pile up, and overall the field generally plays sharper, the amount of content out there be sharper. And so like all those things combined, I felt like it was probably not going to be something that was super profitable for me moving forward unless I was willing to lose $250,000, like, or play with $250,000 bankroll, know?
Right. Of course. So when you get this job offer, right, was it no brainer, right? You took a couple of days, talked to your wife, and yeah, I'm going to do this, or were you really struggling with the decision?
It's tough. I mean, I actually talked to my boss, like, at Sports Grid, because I mean, there's two things. One is like, okay, like let's take this pool of money I make playing DFS, and like let's just assume I can't make that moving forward. It's still a great industry to work in, right?
Yep.
And so it's still something I wouldn't like doing, like the content and stuff if I wasn't playing like at the same stakes that I was. Like I'd feel like the need to be transparent about how I was playing or how I saw the games, and so that would have been like a little bit of a wrestle. But a lot of my work at Sports Grid had shifted towards the betting side of the landscape, like the media side of the business, how to inject product into video content to ultimately convert people to sign up for like the sports books and whatnot. And so there was that side of things. Like that work was still going to be like super interesting work, and so it was kind of comparing the what that work would look like compared to like this job opportunity and like the basically like the money that come along with it, and trying to make that trade off. You have to like ultimately, yeah, if I could make like $250,000 a year playing DFS and like have a great job in the industry, like I would not have like transitioned out, but like I didn't feel confident that it would be like super profitable moving forward. I still think I can play profitably, but not like this huge income stream. And so that was all, it's all part of like the equation.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. That makes a ton of sense. And then, especially in the United States, right? Our work is our identity for the most part, and how you know someone is what they do for a living. As unfortunate or fortunate that as that may be, right? And you mentioned to me that in your circles, like you're the fantasy sports or the betting guy, right? Like your friends or whoever, acquaintances, people you meet,
Yeah.
you're known as the fantasy sports guy. What are those feelings behind that potential change in identity, right? You go from this super cool, at least to most people, right? Super cool job. Oh, this guy, he bets on sports. He does fantasy, he writes about fantasy, and that's his job. And people know you as that. To where now, sorry, I'll just say you got a boring tech startup, right? Like you meet those guys a dime a dozen, right? So what does that change in identity feel like?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely like like now it feels good. Like like it's kind of weird. Like my identity was like tied towards how people on like Twitter would view my success at DFS, or like that my job would be my identity. So in a way, it feels good to like have my identity be like my friendships, relationships, and like my family more so than my work. So, but at the time, like I was making the decision, definitely like a big thing you're wrestling with, because for the past 4 years, like you spend whatever your 40 hours working on in the industry, you spend another 20 hours or whatever playing, and like you have all these relationships with people that some you've met in real life and hung out with, some you're friends with but just from like the internet, but you're still like friends with them, they're real relationships, and you're trying to like reconcile that, and like what is this going to like look like when I announce it, and like am I doing this because I like failed as a DFS player, like put the work stuff aside, like am I doing this because I failed as a DFS player, and like I don't know, is it like okay to admit failure? And I don't really I feel like I've achieved so much. I definitely didn't fail as a DFS player, but at the same time, like I was clearly not viewing that as something that could be sustainable moving forward. So that is like acknowledging defeat in a way. So that was like a big thing to like mentally reconcile. Ultimately, I felt like last thing I wanted to have happen is like you just keep pressing for more years and you just lose more, and like you're gonna regret that too, because you have this inkling in the back of your head that maybe you're not getting it as good anymore.
It's tough, man. It's tough because you have these big wins, and the people whether it's personally or it's on Twitter or subscribers to your site, they expect you to be able to win forever, right? And as realistic or unrealistic as that may be, and like you said, right, you can't acknowledgement of failure, sure, but you've accomplished so much in your personal career that I mean, you said near a million in lifetime earnings, right, or profit. That's insane. But there's still that fact that I'm stopping this, I'm quitting this because I don't think potentially I have the chance to be as good as I have been. And there's always going to be some sort of feeling of defeat or failure in that acknowledgement.
Yeah, and I think the other piece is like, it's a weird like a weird career journey to explain to people, and
Mm.
so it's hard to translate this to other stuff. It's not that it can't be translated, because ultimately a lot of it is like thoughtful analytics and using information to make decisions and drive decision making, and having a process based approach. Like all that stuff is like fundamental to running a good business as well. But just like taking a step back, if you look at like someone's resume, and they go from like tech startup to, I mean, I got lucky. Like when I started at Sports Grid, I thought that we could grow Daily Roto into a good business, but not what Sports Grid's become. And so like
Right.
the legalization of sports betting and like the growth of the media sector of that business was like totally unanticipated by me, at least, not by the people at the vision, but at the time that things started. So I kind of got a little lucky that the resume didn't look quite as weird, just because of the growth we happen to have. And I think one of the things about like this specific opportunity was, on, I kind of acknowledged that like I could keep pressing a DFS for a little bit. The long term, I wasn't confident it could be like an income stream. And then it was also like, okay, if if I'm going to transition out of DFS, I definitely enjoyed the work I was doing. So that was an option, staying there, just not working in DFS, like not playing DFS and just working on like the product side within Sports Grid. But it was also, like it was a really good opportunity. And like this type of opportunity, I was lucky to get because I previously worked for the CEO at one of my former jobs. And it was a chance to like take this role transition without having to explain myself, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
And I was like, if I go out to the market in like 6 months to try to find something similar, like I'm just gonna have to go through this such a huge process for people to understand like this backstory and like what I've done. Whereas I have this great opportunity, pretty cool product. Yeah, it's a tech job. Like a lot of people have jobs in tech, but it's a pretty cool product, pretty cool opportunity with people that I trust and know. And so I just felt like it was probably the right time given the context of everything else.
Yeah, I mean, for those who are looking, if they are a DFS professional and they're looking to get back into the corporate world, that's an interesting conversation that I think a lot of employers probably won't understand. And it does require a heavy effort of explaining of what you did and how that can translate to being successful at this new opportunity. So it's very interesting. It's very interesting to think about because a lot of people don't think about that side.
VCs and people like that might be like pretty interested, and people
Yeah.
have unique thoughts and perspectives. So there are definitely like some clear, but like it'll take a good amount of work for you to develop those relationships, have those conversations with people, and like get them to understand it. Because I don't know. I mean, you've talked to a lot of people about what you do. Like, what percentage of them understand it?
No, I mean it's very very few, right? Unless they actually bet on sports or play fantasy, right? They don't understand it that much, and even then, right? They don't understand the professional aspect of it. Like I treat this as a job because a lot of people you meet, they just think that oh, this guy just plays lineups and he does whatever. When in reality, we're working 60, 80, 100 hours per week. Treat this as a job. We have schedules. I wake up at 6:37 in the morning and work 10 hours a day, and I have things on my checklist that I have to do. It's a real job that people that you have, but again, not many understand it. And again, a new employer may not understand that as well. They see some person who, especially if they Google and they see that you have big wins and they think that that's what you've been doing this whole time as opposed to having this intricate process. It's a tough conversation to have.
Yeah, I think I've listened to some similar podcasts with people who've been either are currently DFS pros or have been DFS pros in the past and moved on, and I think some of them have like basically like effectively said like being a DFS pro is like overly glamorized and like not something people should aspire to. I don't necessarily feel that way. I think like having the aspiration to get there is like really cool because it'll push you to be like your best self as a DFS player. You'll probably really enjoy the learning process and the experience that goes into it. The actual like playing side of things probably loses its allure after like 18 months of doing it and becomes more of a job, like you said. But it's still, and it can be stressful. There are swings. So like the job aspect of things isn't necessarily like playing DFS isn't necessarily as enjoyable as it looks on paper, but like the aspiration to one day get there and to control your own like financial freedom and like to push yourself to be your best, I definitely think aspiring to reach that level, even if you never are able to get there, is still something that is good and part of the dream, I guess.
Yeah, because multiple times per month, I get a message from someone saying, "Hey, I want to do what you do. I want to be a DFS pro. I've played this much. I want to get to that level. I want to be able to do it full time." And most ask for legitimate advice and how they can accomplish that and what it's like to get there. So I can say what my personal experience was, but what about you, Colin? What would you tell someone who wants to be a DFS pro? And then kind of secondarily, and this is a tough question, but what do you think is the most important skill to have if you are a DFS pro?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you want to get there, I think it's a great aspiration to have, and I think you should like earn your way there and don't. So if you think you can get there by being a DFS pro, or as a DFS pro, the best way to get there as a DFS amateur is to grow your bankroll to a level where you're not putting in money from outside of DFS. You're able to grow it as a DFS player and transition your bankroll that way, kind of like organically, and then do it while you're maintaining some consistent income for a period of time. Prove to yourself you're able to do that before you kind of take the leap of faith. I think you have to be pragmatic. Like games are markets trend towards efficiency. Games are getting harder. Edges you have today may not be edges you have tomorrow. So you have to be able to identify new edges and evolve. And so you also have to realize that like nobody knows what like the future of DFS is. Like it'll definitely be a future for 2 to 5 years for sure. Like it's such a key customer acquisition play for the sports books, but it's also like not where their bread and butter is going to be like long term. That's going to be like sports betting and iGaming, and DFS will be a fraction of like their market cap, and so the sites are going to care less about DFS over time, and it definitely is not going away in the next 5 years, and maybe it'll just be core part of like American betting culture for forever. But I think there is like some risk in like 6 to 10 years that it's a lot smaller, different looking than what it is right now.
Yeah, I mean, we start to see some of these sites already care less and less about the DFS side of things and more focus on the sportsbook side of things. So that's definitely in the future. It's going to happen. How much the DFS participation decreases is the big question, but it will decrease, and the emphasis from these sites and these companies will shift more towards sports betting as more and more states legalize it. So you mentioned the identifying the realization of edges. Is there another skill that you think utmost importance to have as a DFS pro?
Kind of like figure out what you can outsource and like outsource it just from like a mental perspective, especially if you're doing something like you are where you're running like a business on the side and playing DFS. Like if you're working for a content site and playing DFS, or maybe you're just playing DFS, but figuring out what you can outsource and where you add value, I think is pretty important. So if you feel like you don't want to spend time doing your own projections, there's obviously a lot of good projection sites out there, or you can aggregate them from multiple projection sources. So like maybe that's not an area you should like take on yourself, but figure out, yeah, so what you can outsource to streamline there. Obviously like tools like an optimizer, like probably not something you should take on yourself unless you're the whistles goes woo guy, right, who can come up with your own really sophisticated approach. And to like originate your own edges would be pretty important, because there are a lot of edges that get talked about, and maybe they do hold for a year, but the next year they're gone because they've been like, I don't know, like game stacking and things like that. Not gone, but like they shift as content outs them as good edges. And whereas if you are able to originate your own edges outside of content, that's something that you can kind of carry forward a little bit more. It's more defensible than picking up on edges from like your favorite content sites and playing those edges, because you just can't count on that sustaining if other people are picking up the same thing as you.
100%. That's really well said, Colin. Really well said. So I guess I'll close out with this, right? Knowing what you know now, you've been in this 4 years, you've had all your success, you're transitioning out. Is there anything that you would go back and tell yourself after your first big win, whether it's the 20K in golf or whether it's that first big showdown score? Is there anything you go back and tell yourself back then that you know now?
Man, I don't know. Like, I mean, I feel like I'm pretty lucky. Like the past 4 years, like going through everything. Yeah, but growing a family, having the pandemic, moving into a house, like been through a lot of life change. So I was pretty lucky. Like DFS played a core role in every aspect of that, except like deciding to grow a family. But it supported, that initiative. It gave me work-life balance and flexibility to pick up the kids from daycare at 4 o'clock or whatever and spend time with them. So I've been pretty lucky and fortunate that DFS and like my job with like Sports Grid and Daily Roto was kind of like perfect for like that period of life. And I think I was happy to take advantage of it the way that I did. I feel like I made the right decision as far as when to transition, because I don't think that was necessarily going to fit everything I needed moving forward. But I'm happy it was there when I needed it then.
For sure. And I'm super thrilled for you to get out when you wanted to get out. Not a lot of people get out on their own terms. So, again, just personally, I'm super thrilled for you. And I know your corporate lunch break is coming to a close here, Colin. So I'll give you the floor. Any final thoughts, topics we haven't talked about, anything else you want to get out there about living the life as a DFS pro, the mental side of it, the emotional bankroll side of things?
Yeah, I mean, just like there's no harm in not living the life as a DFS pro. Like enjoying your hobby, like working in the space definitely ruins your hobby to some degree. And so having DFS as a hobby is something that I'm interested to see if I'll like enjoy it more moving forward. Like I'm still gonna play, right? Like so I'm still gonna be playing, just not quite as seriously, just not quite as frequently. And so I'm curious to see if I'm able to like regain that enjoyment I had with it during like my first couple of years. But definitely, like there's no shame in having DFS be your hobby and your side income, and not having it be like your professional responsibility, and enjoying the experience of DFS is something I'm hopeful I'll be able to get back to.
That's very well said, and I hope for your sake, Colin, that you do super enjoy DFS. Maybe just stay out of the showdown streets, though. I'll take those if you want to find some other.
Man,
edges.
I'm coming for the Super Bowl for sure. Can't keep me away from the Super Bowl.
Good. Well, hopefully we see you at the top of the Super Bowl GPPs, Colin. Again, I appreciate you sitting down with me, Colin, to talk through this. Not a lot of people are willing to open the curtain and get an insight into the mental side of things. So, it's vulnerable to talk about. So I appreciate you doing that. I appreciate, our friendship and our work that we've done over the years. So I'm super happy for you. And just want to say congrats on the transition, and really appreciate you joining me today.
Hey, man, thanks a lot. It's been good. Obviously, respect you a lot. I've learned a ton from you over the years as well, as far as the edge side of things. So, people are listening to this. I think they're in a pretty good place to help their thought processes for figuring all this stuff out.
Sounds good. Appreciate you, Colin. Thanks again.